long. I mean, its reach is far shorter than we claim it to be. So for the population of the Soviet Union, for Eastern Europe, for Afghanistan, the Soviet Union is a real threat, and I don't see how anybody can question that. On the other hand, the United States has created the image of a Soviet threat just for the same reasons that they create an image of an American threat, as a way for us to justify intervention and aggression in our own domains. And in fact, if you look over the history of the Cold War, I think this is transparent. Take any incident of the Cold War, you know, from the American intervention in Greece in 1947 up to today in Nicaragua, and you will find that every single time a Soviet threat has been created and usually fabricated to justify American intervention. And incidentally, they play precisely the same game.
We started off, though, talking about the internal system in the Soviet Union, the degree to which it's a repressive society, because that's certainly the perception of most Americans. But in what sense, if any, does that is that related to its behavior vis-a-vis other nations as well as its own people? Because, for example, I think many people believe you can't trust the Russians. They never abide by treaties. They never keep their promises. They're really not a nation like other nations. They're not part of the community of nations. They're a
How about trying this? The Russians don't keep their promises because they are a nation like other nations. In fact, the fact is anyone who believes the promises of any nation state is out of their minds or just doesn't know anything about history, and that includes us and every other one.
I think so.
I mean, you know, states follow their promises if it's in their interest to do so, and the point is to try to create a system of shared interest which will bring about a certain degree of observance to international agreements. Now, if we look at it that way, then it seems to me the Russian record is certainly no worse than ours.
In fact, it's pretty good in terms of arms control, because I think the Soviet government sees it's in its interest to observe those treaties, and the SALT I treaty, even SALT II, though Mr. Reagan insinuated the other day maybe they weren't keeping some of the SALT II provisions, even though it's not been formally ratified. I think both sides, you know, for pragmatic, prudent reasons, have been living up to it. I think Noam is absolutely right. In fact, Mr. Reagan right now is violating our solemn agreements to both the Organization of American States and the UN with this business in Nicaragua, which is just typical of how big power states operate. I would say that the Soviet position, just to argue a point, from the very beginning has been a defensive one, essentially, that they, from the very beginning, felt under duress from the West, that they insisted after World War II of occupying all those countries around their European perimeter, and they've been very tough there, as has been pointed out, in Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Afghanistan is on their frontier, and that along that line, there's no doubt there's much to be criticized. We criticize the internal repression. But both of those things, I think, get confused in the American mind with this idea of a Soviet military threat to the United States. Because most of the arguments go back to Afghanistan, for example, or Poland, and I think you could admit all of the negative things and still argue that their whole position militarily has been one of reacting and responding to the West, even today. Their leaders say we will never first use a nuclear weapon, and Mr. Reagan says no. Mr. Reagan brings up the whole Star Wars concept now of outer space. They have been pressing against that. So I mean we should need to discuss this issue as to whether or not it isn't true that the threat and the initiative in the arms race has come from the United States rather than the Soviet Union.
But I don't think that's the only issue involved. I mean, but I don't, so the Russians indeed do tend to be defensive about their perimeter, although Afghanistan is again another issue. But I don't think it's fair to say they've only been concerned just about their perimeter. I mean, the best illustration in my mind was Khrushchev's attempt to put the missiles in Cuba. That, I think, Americans look upon as going outside. Now, that's not to say that we haven't done the same thing to them. It's a question of how do the Americans perceive it. In other words, the Russians are not innocuous. There's another problem involved, and that is that as concerned as I am about our military-industrial complex, I'm equally or even more concerned about the Soviet military-industrial complex because I think it's more powerful.
Let me just introduce a qualification. I don't agree with you about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that was a perfect example of a defensive move. And we maybe could go into that, but let's...
I don't know how you would define offensive.
Well, that's defensive because, in fact, what the Russians were trying to do was to counter an overwhelming advantage in missiles that they knew that we knew.
Sure.
It was after Penkovsky. Well, maybe we should put that aside. But aside from that, I think your point is not only right, but it's exactly what we ought to be talking about. If you look at the history of the arms race, there's just no doubt that the United States had the initiative. But the reason for that, I think, is very simple. We're a more powerful and more technologically advanced country. So, of course, we're going to always have the more advanced military technology. Now, the important point that you made, Marshall, I think that I certainly agree with. You thought you were going to be isolated, but you're not. I think that the main thrust, the main pressure for militarization and the arms race in the Soviet Union comes from the internal dynamics of the society. I mean, I think once we dissociate our discussion from what, in my view, are kind of irrelevant considerations, like whether nations abide by states abide by their treaties and so on. No, of course they don't. And we ask ourselves, what is the concrete situation today? I think what we see is that the United States is deeply committed to a massive program of domestic militarization for the same kinds of reasons that drove it in 1961 and that drove it in 1950, and that have nothing to do with any perceived international threat. And we ought to understand that. If we want to know, I mean, I think it's very clear. I think the Reagan administration the programs that the Reagan administration is following were in fact proposed in late 1978, but they couldn't be pushed through Congress at that time. Reagan extended them and accelerated them, and they're absolutely classical in the American system. When there is a domestic repression in the United States, when there's a domestic recession in the United States, the standard reaction is to turn to in fact, let me make it more general, any modern industrial society has recognized since the 1940s that the way to deal with internal economic problems is through state intervention. I mean, the institutional structures of American society happen to be such that there is no coordinated state planning. Yeah. We don't have the system that they have in Japan, where there's a government ministry, right, which deals with, highly centralized foci of industry and brings them together and makes a long-term economic plan. We don't have the institutional structure for that. We have a different institutional structure. Our institutional structure, as it's developed since the Second World War, is that the technique by which the government stimulates production is by creating a state-guaranteed market.
Another perception I think that a great many Americans have is that the goal of Soviet foreign and military policy is really world domination. And that's really what it's all about. And it's a fear that Americans have that this is indeed the goal of Soviet policy. Is this true?
I think that one of the misperceptions that Americans have is that the Soviet Union is just kind of like a vacuum cleaner running over one country after another. But they do the same kinds of things that big powers do that we've done. But that doesn't mean, again, that you can sit back and say, well, whatever they do is innocuous.
Well, look, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Russians, in their international behavior, behave very much like any other power, including us. I mean, every power, great or small, tries to extend the influence of the extent of its degree to coerce and control and penetrate markets and so on and so forth, get resources. We happen to be the world's most powerful force. In the early post-war period, we were overwhelmingly the world's most powerful force, and therefore the United States did, in fact, we can easily document this both in the documentary record and the historical record, the United States did, in fact, set forth on a policy of global domination. And it succeeded to a surprising extent. Since that period, and the Russians did so also in their much smaller sphere. Now, since that period, this bipolar system has, in fact, eroded. I mean, other powers have developed, Europe, Japan, elements of the Third World, and in fact, the degree of the two superpowers to coerce and control us in our huge domains and them in their smaller domains, that has declined.
One may readily agree the Soviet system is totalitarian, but that there's a lot of illusions among ordinary Americans that if we go somewhere in the world, we're out to promote democracy. This is the Reagan line. I would say that from what I've observed living in Asia and in observing what's going on in Latin America, this is simply not true. This is another one of those rhetorical statements that helps to build up support for U.S. policy that should be challenged. That the Wall Street Journal had a report, an article urging U.S. corporations to invest in East Asia. And you know what the rationale was? It's a beautiful euphemism. Korea, Thailand, Philippines, they have firm political management. This rationale of the American mission in the world as being benevolent and democratic, I think that has to be also taken issue with.
Well, we could point out that again, it's quite general, every society perceives itself or tries to make its public perceive itself as benevolent. I mean, the British were carrying the white man's burden, and the French had a civilizing mission, and the Russians are doing their internationalist duty when they invade